Did the 17th Amendment destroy the structure of the Constitution from the founders and the ratifiers? Well, spoiler alert, yes, but let's dive into this. When the framers designed the Senate, they envisioned it as a safeguard for the states, with a key component being the state legislatures choosing senators instead of the people at large. But in 1913, the 17th Amendment removed this critical part of the original system. So today I've got a deep dive into this long-forgotten part of the original Constitution, how it came to be at the Philadelphia Convention. We're going to go into that, reasons they set it up that way, and warnings we were given against changing it to, well, what it is today. But first of all, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, August 12th, 2024. Now let's get right to this. Passed by Congress on May 13th, 1912, and then ratified in April of 1913, the 17th Amendment modified Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution by allowing voters to cast direct votes for U.S. senators. Previously, well, it was state legislatures. And here we can see here from the National Archives, they point out that prior to its passage, senators were chosen by state legislatures. The Constitution, as it was adopted in 1788, made the Senate an assembly where the states would have equal representation. Each state legislature would elect 2 senators to 6-year terms. Now, this structure came about at the Philadelphia Convention, but at first they certainly did not want that structure. On May 29th, 1787, right at the beginning, Edmund Randolph presented the Virginia Plan. This was also heavily drafted by James Madison. They proposed the creation of a bicameral legislature, but under their proposal, known as the Virginia, or what they want to call the Randolph Plan, membership in both houses would be allocated to each state proportional to its population. Candidates in this original plan for the lower house would be nominated and elected by the people of each state, while candidates for the upper house would be nominated by the state legislatures and then elected by the members of the lower house. So kind of combining these things. But less populous states we know, like Delaware, were afraid that such an arrangement would result in their voices and interests being drowned out by the larger states. So pretty quickly into it, we see people at the Philadelphia Convention start to propose something different. For example, here's John Dickinson. On June 6th, he considered it essential that one branch of the legislature should be drawn immediately from the people. This combination of the state governments with the national government was as politic as it was unavoidable. And then we have the Connecticut delegates, this kind of tag team trio of William Samuel Johnson, Oliver Ellsworth, and Roger Sherman. On June 11th, Sherman proposed that the proportion of suffrage in the first branch should be according to the respective numbers of free inhabitants, and that in the second branch, or Senate, each state should have 1 vote and no more. They wanted kind of equal representation to make it a federal system. He said as the states would remain possessed of certain individual rights, each state ought to be able to protect itself. Otherwise, a few large states will rule the rest. This was an argument against proportional representation on the Senate side. Now, in response to this proposal from the Virginia people, this was the leading thing discussed at the Philadelphia Convention for the first 4 to 6, if not longer, weeks. There was a proposal in response from William Patterson, primarily of New Jersey. They call it the New Jersey Plan. And here from Wikipedia, which has a pretty decent overview on this, with the assistance of Roger Sherman, Maryland's David Brearley and Luther Martin, and New York's John Lansing, proposed a unicameral legislature, so just one house. Introduced on June 15th, this New Jersey plan provided that each state was to have equal representation in the legislature, regardless of population. This position reflected the belief that the states were independent entities, and as they entered the United States freely and individually, they remained that way. So this is on June 15th, 1787. Then we have Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was not a fan, of course, of anything that would be different than a total centralized national system, and he gave a big government plan, the biggest of them all, on June 18th, 1787. It was kind of the high water mark for heavy centralization or consolidation of power. But here he was on June 18th in this long speech. He said he was particularly opposed to the plan from New Jersey, being fully convinced that no amendment of the Confederation, of course, they wanted to keep the Articles of Confederation, make some changes, but he said, no, you can't even do that. He said, leaving the states in possession of their sovereignty could possibly answer the purpose. He wanted everything. He wanted a sovereign central government, which I guess is very similar, if not more powerful, than what they had against the British. Now, he was not alone on this part. There are others who certainly wanted to oppose that New Jersey plan. But then he proposed a Senate for life during good behavior. But he said another destructive ingredient in this plan is that equality of suffrage, which is so much desired by the small states. He did not want the states to have equal representation. He said it is not in human nature that Virginia and large states should consent to it, or if they did, that they should long abide by it. It shocks too much of the ideas of justice and every human feeling. So Alexander Hamilton was kind of leading the opposition to a federal system and pushing for a national system. James Madison was on that team as well, with Hamilton just not as extreme. But on June 19th, 1787, the delegates rejected the New Jersey plan and voted to proceed with another discussion of Virginia's plan. The small states, though, became increasingly discontented, and some threatened to withdraw. So we ended up having a compromise come out of this. It's called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise, primarily because those Connecticut delegates that I mentioned before, Johnson, Ellsworth, and Sherman, were leading advocates of it. And here from Rob Nadelson, he writes, the convention proceedings of June 29th and 30th exemplify the Connecticut tag team at work. On the 29th, Johnson delivered a speech in which he argued that the Constitution should recognize the states as both groups of individuals and as separate political societies in their own right. So they're looking at sovereignty of the states, representation for the people by popular assembly, and then equal suffrage on the Senate side. Next, Ellsworth described this system as partly national, partly federal. This was a characterization that James Madison copied and used in Federalist number 39. And then on the 30th, Ellsworth reiterated Johnson's argument for enabling the states to protect themselves, and Sherman backed them up. So by July 2nd, the convention was pretty deadlocked over this. They were voting back and forth and killing stuff. So it was sent to a committee to come up with a resolution. And even though it's called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise, and the Connecticut delegates of Johnson, Sherman, and Ellsworth were the primary drafters of it, they were largely responsible. It actually was Benjamin Franklin who headed the committee that proposed the compromise and moved its adoption, writes Nadelson. He said this was the bargain whereby, 1, the House of Representatives was going to be allocated mostly by population. 2, each state was to have 2 senators. But 3, only the House could initiate revenue bills. And this was opposed. Madison, tooth and nail, tried to kill this type of proposal. It was also opposed, of course, by Alexander Hamilton, Governor Morris, James Wilson, Rufus King. Here's an example of his view, because he wanted to create a national government, not a federal system, just like James Wilson, just like Hamilton, just like Randolph, just like Madison and many others. If you've been following the work that we do on this, we cover their early proposals for sure. But Rufus King considered the proposed government as substantially and formally a general and national government over the people of America. This was not going to be a federal system. So if you had a national government, you couldn't have equal representation of the states. He thought that was totally repulsive to it. And he said he preferred the doing of nothing. He wanted nothing done on this part than allowing an equal vote to all the states. He felt it would be better, he thought, to submit to a little more confusion and convulsion than to submit to such an evil. Now, keep in mind that many of the arguments pushed for by people who wanted to expand power, give more energy, is how they called it, to the Articles of Confederation or to a new system under whatever they came up with in Philadelphia, one of the big arguments was if we don't do something right now, that stuff that happened in Massachusetts, that rebellion, it's going to be everywhere. We're going to have total chaos and war everywhere. And King was he was certainly part of that messaging, but he was so opposed to equal representation for the states in the Senate that he was willing to throw that all aside. So either he was just lying about the hype about the rebellion and what might happen, or he was just trying to be emphatic and saying, this is such an evil thing. If we want a national government, we can't have the states represented. In fact, we know Alexander Hamilton on the 18th, he specifically said, hey, I'd be down to get rid of the states if we could get away with it. But I know public opinion isn't going to be on board with this. So then after 6 weeks of debate, back and forth, turmoil, on July 16th, 1787, North Carolina switched its vote to equal representation per state. Massachusetts was divided, and a compromise, the Connecticut Compromise, was reached on a 5-4 vote. So now they're switching from the national plan to a partly federal one. Every state was given equal representation, previously known as the New Jersey Plan, in one house of Congress, and proportional representation, the Virginia Plan, in the other house. So the Constitution was sent to the states for ratification that had a Senate where the states would have equal representation. And state legislatures would elect 2 senators for 6-year terms. And during these ratification debates, Federalists, even those who didn't like that setup, they vehemently supported the system because they wanted to get ratification, of course. And it was, even though they weren't totally in favor of it, James Madison specifically, we know he was vehemently opposed to the idea of equal representation of each state. One state, one vote, or one state, 2 votes, however you want to put it. He did not like it. And in Federalist number 62, he specifically called it a lesser evil. So at least he was being honest about it. He said the equality of representation in the Senate is another point which, being evidently the result of compromise between the opposite pretensions of the large and the small states, does not call for much discussion. I'm not sure if he's just saying doesn't need much discussion because he's really not on board with it, or that everyone's okay with it at that point. I'm not really sure. But he said under this alternative, the advice of prudence must be to embrace the lesser evil. So he looked at what they had there as the lesser evil. He thought a purely federal system where it was just states each had total one state, one vote representation, like under the Articles of Confederation, he thought that was a total evil. That was what they were trying to get rid of. So he's saying, this is a lesser evil. And he said, instead of indulging a fruitless anticipation of the possible mischiefs which may ensue, to contemplate rather the advantageous consequences which may qualify the sacrifice. In other words, let's find the silver. I don't like this, and I'm not going to spend too much time saying anything negative about this because I want it to pass. But let's find the silver lining. And he was definitely finding a silver lining. He said, in this spirit, it may be remarked that the equal vote allowed to each state is at once a constitutional recognition of the portion of sovereignty remaining in the individual states, and an instrument for preserving that residuary sovereignty. So sovereignty meaning final authority. And of course, when we're talking about sovereignty, there were some people who debated this, but in general, it was the understanding that no government really held sovereignty or final authority. All levels of government are emanations or delegations of power from the people of the several states who hold final sovereignty, final authority. But Madison thought it was a lesser evil. Let's find this silver lining. Fisher Ames also pointed out in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention the same type of thing. Not necessarily that it was a lesser evil, but representing the states and making sure that the sovereignty of the people of the several states is still part of the system. The senators, he said, represent the sovereignty of the states. In the other house, individuals are represented. And again, even though Madison thought that equal representation, the number of senators per state, was at best a lesser evil, with maybe a silver lining, kinda, the method of choosing the senators for Madison by state legislature had no such caveat. He was fully on board with that. And he pointed that out again in Federalist number 62. He said, it is equally unnecessary to dilate, expand on basically, on the appointment of senators by the state legislatures. Among the various modes which might have been devised for constituting this branch of the government, that which has been proposed by the convention is probably the most congenial with the public opinion. Now, he's saying, this is what the people are going to want, is that the state legislatures are choosing senators. He said it is recommended by the double advantage. So he's also saying this is super great, not only because the people are going to be on board with it, but because we have extra security. He said it's a double advantage of favoring a select appointment and of giving to the state governments such an agency in the formation of the federal government as must secure the authority of the former and may form a convenient link between the two systems. So it's a defense for the states against being totally consolidated. And consolidation was the great threat. Now, some people looked at the warnings by the Anti-Federalists that the system would lead to consolidation as just a bugbear. No, we've created a perfect system in order to prevent that. Well, not perfect, but we've created a system to really prevent most versions of what might happen. James Madison felt, even though he wanted a much stronger general government, he wasn't on board with what he saw as consolidation or total centralization of power. And he thought this was basically, I'll get to this a little bit later in the episode, but this was basically the final line in the sand. Without this choice by state legislatures of senators, he felt it would be a totally consolidated system. In other words, a tool of total despotism and tyranny. Now, Tench Coxe also discussed this. Many of the Federalists certainly did. Tench Coxe talked about this, and he said he viewed, and here from an article by Mike Meharry, he viewed the selection of senators by state legislatures as an important division of power because they would, quote, feel a considerable check from the constitutional powers of the state legislatures. They're responsible for the state legislature, so they're going to try to make them happy. And if the state legislatures are supposed to represent the interests of the people of the state, then certainly this is about setting up a structure that is more federal. So he was seeing it as a check from the constitutional powers of the state legislatures, whose rights they will not be disposed to infringe, since they are the bodies to which they owe their existence, and are moreover to remain the immediate guardians of the people. Now, you may have noticed, a quick aside, a number of them referring to states and rights. And I know it's very common for people to say today, states don't have rights. And absolutely, if we're thinking about rights in the way that most people use it in modern times, individual liberty, that is absolutely correct. But many of the founders often used the word rights and powers almost interchangeably, depending on the context. I would read Cox's view on that like this. Just a quick aside. Anyways, Mike Meharry goes a little further. He said, furthermore, Tench Coxe argued that state legislature appointments of senators would ensure that they would be, quote, detached as much as possible from local prejudices in favor of their respective state by having a separate and independent vote bound by his person, honor, and character. They were very much concerned with the danger of factions and popular kind of currents, which could sometimes be good, but oftentimes throughout history were certainly bad. Madison, of course, wrote quite a bit about this in Federalist number 10. It is probably the best example of the Federalist view on this. Now, here's James Iredell also talking about this. He was one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court. He discussed it in July of 1788. He said, the manner in which our Senate is to be chosen gives us an additional security. So again, they keep reiterating, they're telling the ratifying public, if you guys are going to support this, here's why. And the way that we've structured this Senate, even if we're not on board, like Madison's saying, I'm not on board. Not everybody was taking that view. I don't think Iredell was opposing the equal suffrage because North Carolina ended up on board with that, and he was part of that process. But Iredell, I'm not sure actually if he was at the convention, but anyways, Iredell was very influential in the ratification debates, and he was one of the top legal minds in North Carolina. And he's talking about how representation, the way that they're choosing the representatives or the senators, was a big part of the security for the states. He says our senators will not be chosen by a king. If you're comparing it to the House of Lords, you couldn't have that type of a setup here in the United States. They would not be tainted by his influence. They are to be chosen by the different legislatures in the Union. He said, holding no office under the United States, they will be under no temptation of that kind to forget the interests of their constituents. Now, all this stuff is going to be linked to, you might be saying, hey, Bolden, what was that one that you referenced? What was that Tench Cox thing or Madison's Federalist 62, whatever? We publish a blog post about 2 hours after every single live stream is done. Alan Mosley is so awesome, being really consistent about getting that done every single time. And for each blog post, you're going to find not only all the different platforms we're on, because we live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and X and LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitch. We also live stream over at rumble.com and odyssey.com. We have the audio-only podcast edition on every place that we can get to. But if we're missing from one of these, please let us know. If we're missing from a platform you like to use, just send us an email, team@10thamendmentcenter.com, and we'll check it out. But we also have a section in there that's a show link section for every single blog post for every episode. That way, as you're following along, I'm really just scratching the surface, and I know I'm blasting through a lot of this information pretty quickly, and it's really important if you want to learn more about this to read all this stuff in context on your own time. So Alan will get that organized, and I will get it published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty in a couple of hours. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment to say hello to everyone out in the live chat. There's Karma and Dennis and Peace and Gypsy and Brewster over on Rumble. I appreciate you guys being here. I know I'm skipping over a few people here. Bastiat and Kirk and Snowfish and Joker and Howard Clegg, appreciate your support. Michael Morris and a number of other people. Again, thank you for being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. So we're discussing how they came up with this proposal, this great compromise in order to create this structure of the Senate. And then we're looking at some of the arguments, even from people like James Madison saying, oh, yeah, I may not have been in favor of all of it. It's a lesser of evil. But what I'm fully on board with is the idea of state legislatures choosing those senators because it is a defense for the states. James Iredell saying the same thing, Tench Cox. Now, the anti-federalists were not on board with this. And many of them, but not all, were actually against having state legislatures choose the senators. Fascinating kind of twist there. George Mason, for example, one of the most prominent anti-federalists whose, they were published. His opinions on this, his opposition to the Constitution, were published without him wanting them to be published, but they were spread around pretty widely, and a lot of the other anti-federalist writers kind of followed his lead. But over at the Philadelphia Convention, Mason said, quote, there was a better chance for proper elections by the people if divided into large districts than by state legislatures. So he was one of the leading anti-federalists. They weren't all of this mind, but he wanted to see the Senate elected by popular vote. And his objections to the Constitution, which were, again, very influential, also mentioned opposition to a Senate that wasn't a direct representation of the people. I covered his total objections to the Constitution in an episode just last month, George Mason versus the Constitution, top anti-federalist arguments. I don't get into the Senate too much there, but I do have another episode on the anti-federalist view of the Senate. The imperial Senate is how they looked at it, and aristocracy a little bit later in the episode. Now, in general, many of the anti-federalists, again, they warned it would degenerate. The Senate would degenerate the entire system into what they called a tyrannical aristocracy. And in Federalist number 63, James Madison responded to that. He said, before such a revolution can be effected, the Senate, it is to be observed, must in the first place corrupt itself. It must next corrupt the state legislatures. It must then corrupt the House of Representatives, and must finally corrupt the people at large. Now, that may have been the case, but he's certainly saying with this structure, because the state legislatures are kind of this part of this process, it creates a whole nother layer to prevent against a tyrannical aristocracy. He said, without corrupting the state legislatures, it cannot prosecute the attempt, because even if the people are corrupt, the state legislatures are not, they remain a bulwark still. You've got all these different checks and balances, which also includes the states. It's not just checks and balances of the federal government against the federal government. He said, because the periodical change of members would otherwise regenerate the whole body. That's Madison in Federalist number 63. They also, on the Federalist side, made the case that this would be a tool of self-preservation. There was a lot of warning on the anti-Federalist side that the proposed powers for the federal government would swallow up the states. It would completely get rid of them, or they would just remain kind of in name only, kind of what Alexander Hamilton was calling for at the Philadelphia Convention. So basically annihilating them. And here's James Wilson in the Pennsylvania ratifying convention. Again, this will be linked to in the show notes so you can read it in full. He said, in the system before you, the senators, sir, those tyrants that are to devour the legislatures of the states, are to be chosen by the state legislatures themselves. Need anything more be said on this subject? He's saying, like, look, if you're concerned about this body destroying the states, they only exist because of the states. And that was the way that they looked at that check and balance actually working. He said, so far as the principle of each state's retaining the power of self-preservation from being weakened or endangered by the general government, that the convention went even further, perhaps, than was strictly proper in order to secure for it, for in this second branch of the legislature, each state, without regard to its importance, is entitled to an equal vote. Now, that's James Wilson, who I think when it got down to it, when there was a 10-1 vote against a proportional representation in the Philadelphia Convention, it was James Wilson who was the one no vote. He definitely wanted the Senate chosen by the people at large. Now, he's saying that or based on population. Now, he was also on board with the state legislatures choosing it. He just thought that each state should have different numbers of senators. So he's saying, look, we even went further than this awesome bulwark to protect the state governments. There's no way the federal government or the Senate can swallow up their creators. Here's a James Madison in the Virginia ratifying convention. He said, this election of one branch of the federal by the state legislatures secures an absolute dependence of the former on the latter. So if you're concerned that the federal government is going to swallow up the states, how can they get away with it, they're making the case, if the federal government is reliant on the states for its very existence? And that's how Governor Johnston of North Carolina put it. He was even more forceful. He said, as long as the state legislatures have it in their power not to choose the senators, he's saying, like, what if they decide not to? He said they can put an end to the general government by refusing to choose senators. Man, threatening us all with an awesome time here today, Governor Johnston. Here's John Jay writing in Federalist 64. This is Federalists arguing that the structure would also serve as a defense against too much democracy. Now, some people wanted more popular power, basically a popular assembly only, choice of the people. But many on the Federalist side and some on the anti-Federalist side thought that too much was not a good thing. So you had to kind of temper that. And the Senate was part of that structure, not only having equal representation for the states, but again, choosing the senators by state legislatures was a part of that as well. Here's John Jay. He said, the convention appears to have been attentive to both of these points. They have directed the president to be chosen by select bodies of electors, to be deputed by the people for that express purpose. And they have committed the appointment of senators to the state legislatures. This mode has, in such cases, vastly the advantage of elections by the people in their collective capacity, where the activity of party zeal, taking the advantage of the supineness, the ignorance, and the hopes and fears of the unwary and interested, often places men in office by the votes of a small proportion of the electors. That's John Jay in Federalist 64. And here's James Iredell again, same type of a message. As the representatives of the people may probably be more popular, and it may sometimes be necessary for the Senate to prevent factious measures taking place. Again, fighting the danger of factions. They were very much concerned about that, which may be highly injurious to the real interest of the public. The Senate should not be at the mercy of every popular clamor. So we see this over and over and over again from the Federalist side telling us, like, we do not want a Senate that can be chosen by the people at large. This is a bad choice. And James Madison, who did not like that equal representation, he took the position that choosing the Senate by population would actually, if you actually got rid of that system, this was his warning. He's like, without this, it's going to transform the system into a totally consolidated system. The thing that the anti-federalists are warning us is going to happen, that we're telling them, no, it's not going to happen. So if we get rid of this choice of senators by state legislatures, it is going to be a totally consolidated system. In other words, it would be a total tyranny. And here's how he put it. I can say, notwithstanding what the honorable gentleman has alleged, probably Patrick Henry here, that this government is not completely consolidated, nor is it entirely federal. Who are the parties to it? The people. But not the people as composing one great body, but the people as composing 13 sovereignties. And when he discusses this, he looks at the Senate. When we come to the Senate, its members are elected by the states in their equal and political capacity. But, and here's his warning, had the government been completely consolidated, the Senate would have been chosen by the people in their individual capacity in the same manner as the members of the other house. So James Madison is telling us the thing that is preventing this from being a totally consolidated system, basically a despotism, is the choice of senators by the state legislatures. And he was not alone on this. Another example is Fisher Ames. He said, but whom in that case would they represent? Not the legislatures of the states, but the people. This would totally obliterate the federal features of the Constitution. So did the 17th Amendment destroy the structure of the Constitution? Well, if you look at what it was originally and what these Federalists are even telling us, the ones who sold us the Constitution, they're telling us that without choice of senators by state legislatures, it would, as Fisher Ames put it, obliterate the federal features of the Constitution. He said, what would become of the state governments, and on whom would devolve the duty of defending them against the encroachments of the federal government? He said a consolidation of the states would ensue, which, it is conceded, would subvert the new Constitution, and against which this very article, so much condemned, is our best security. Too much provision cannot be made against a consolidation. So let's recap these points here. The original structure of the Senate was to ensure a number of things, like 4 or 5, depending on how you count them. First of all, representation of the sovereignty of the people of the several states and equal treatment of each, so equal voice for each of the states. A defense for the state governments against the federal government trying to swallow up the states, all their power. A tool of self-preservation for the states to not just be mere political subdivisions of a central consolidated system. 3, a defense against democracy, too much democracy and the factions and fighting and destruction that comes with it. A defense against total consolidation of power, centralized power. And last, keep the federal government reliant on the state governments for its very existence. Just like Governor Johnston said in North Carolina, like, if they don't even choose senators, then you don't have a Senate, you don't have a federal government. Now, with the 17th Amendment, all of these things, all of these structural roadblocks were totally eliminated. And I think we ended up with a consolidated system that Madison, Ames, and others warned us about what we have right now. Now, since the government-run schools never teach any of this history, I mean, I never learned any of it. Maybe you did. If you did, you got pretty lucky. But we think it's absolutely essential to get this foundational historical information out to more and more people. And there is absolutely nothing that helps us do this work more every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you've got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. We punch way above our weight class, and it helps us do this work and reach and teach more and more people about the Constitution and liberty, how to defend both when the government refuses to do so, which is 24/7, 365. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. And I do want to take a quick moment to say a massive thank you to just a handful of people who have joined us as members lately. I know I'm skipping over a number of them, but I really appreciate all of you. There's Keith in New Hampshire, Linda in Texas, Stephen in Arizona, Randall in California, Jennifer in Kansas, and Howard in Iowa. I really appreciate you all. I appreciate your support. I will have to take a look over in the chat a little bit later today or tomorrow. I do get a chance to read through almost all of the comments and your emails at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I don't get a chance to reply to too many. I should point out that it's very likely I will not have a show on Wednesday. I've got a bunch of stuff in my schedule that I have to catch up on. But if I get a chance to do it, I will. But at this point, I'm not expecting to be able to have a show on Wednesday. But I do appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something that's more important than anything. And I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty.